welcome to everyone. Lovely to see you.
I think I am recording. I think. Let me press the
button.
button.
It says it started, Tracy.
Yeah, that was me, Joe, so it is recording.
Brilliant, fantastic. So welcome first of all. I'm Joe Lyons, Head of Science here at Egg Buckland, and volunteered to run these network sessions amongst us. We've also got Tracy with us today, and Heidi both are going to chip in and do little bits as we go through. But really, it's that collaborative aspect really that we're going to work together to reassure each other, hopefully, on what we're doing with CAGs is what we want and where we are. It is that collaboration. So if you were in a moment ago, Heidi or Tracy said, please do comment it into the chat or raise your hands if you want to say something or unmute and ask those questions, because that's what we're here for, is that collaborative approach. But really what we want to do is just share good practice. I'm sure we're all doing really good things. I've had some fantastic conversations with some of you about what we're doing for CAGs or tags, but I thought to get together and to share that on a wider platform would be a nicer thing to do, so we can share more ideas and how we're coming up with those grades and the evidence in which we're getting for them. Reflect on what we're doing, if there's anything that we can take forward from this into future. I know I've got some ideas that come out of this process that was thrown upon us that actually we can take forward into future years to make our process even more robust of mocks and things like that. And for us to get to know each other and plan some future sessions in which we might like. I've put on there, you can also use this session for your own quality assurance records. I know there's probably JCQ documents you're doing left, right and centre for LT and to be submitted. So obviously this can form part of that evidence, the discussion now in which we're going to have. Dan has kindly agreed to be taking some minutes in which we'll distribute after the session as well. So you've obviously got that written record as well as the recording that's started there. I mentioned we've got Heidi and Tracy with us. I think Heidi, you wanted to mention this slide here.
Yes, it's just about a series of events that we've planned for Plymouth schools, all fully funded, but off the back of the support that we ran last term and the term before, we thought it'd be really useful to involve the STEM Ambassador Hub. And similar events to these have happened up in Tracy's area, actually. I mean, they've been really well received. So we've planned to deliver a series of 4 sessions. And what they're focused on is looking at careers in science, that are the sort of careers that are linked to the tricky bits of the curriculum. So we've got STEM ambassadors that are local to Plymouth that have those sorts of careers that will be talking through how they use science in their jobs. And yeah, it's an hour session after school. We've chosen the dates because we obviously wanted it to be after these teacher assessed grades. So hopefully it'll be a better time for you to attend. And I will send I haven't got the booking link for it yet, but I will send it out in an email in the next couple of days once I receive it. And if anybody's got any questions about it, just fire away in the chat. It's really aimed at all teachers, both science. There's also a session on computer science, trainee teachers, science leaders, careers leaders in your schools. Everybody's welcome to attend. And like I said, it's fully funded. That's it from me.
Lovely, thank you, Heidi. Tracy, I think what you're going to do is you're going to set the scene and give us some information from what the exam boards are saying before we open up into a discussion about all the points in which you mentioned and some questions and queries, which I know I've had with people, and to build on what you're saying and what we're doing in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm not going to talk for long because, as you said, the idea today is that you have a chance to share, even if it's just to be reassured that you're on the same page as other people, then that's, it's worth taking an hour to do that. So I've just got 3-4 slides just to set the scene, and really just not to teach you to suck eggs, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on a lot of these points. But one of the slides especially is really to get you thinking about prompting any questions that you might have or promoting that discussion that might go on later in the session. So just setting the scene. I don't need to tell you that JCQ provide guidance and support, as do your awarding organisations, because I'm sure you're all fully aware of that and you're living and breathing this. I was interested just to know if you want to stick in the text chat, if you've got that function, whether you're AQA or EdXL. I saw one school signed up that I knew was EdXL, but I was assuming that most people were going to be AQA. So I'll just have a look at that. Okay, and I'm not sure whether anybody at Excel was here actually. Okay, all right. So as you're doing that, I will keep an eye on that. So because the guidance has come from JCQ, actually, whether you're talking AQA or Edexcel, there are some slight differences and some nuances. And sorry, I should have said why I'm here. Heidi mentioned up in my region, I'm up north, so I'm in the Wirral, Merseyside. I'm an independent science consultant, but I work for both Edexcel and AQA. So as a credible specialist for Edexcel and an advocate for AQA, which just means I run some of their hubs and provide some of their support materials, CPD materials for hubs and additional support. Oh, Andy's Edexcel, thank you, Andy. It was you had spotted that I knew was Edexcel. So I've got insight into both, and I might flip and talk about both of them at some points. But actually, because the guidance comes from JCQ, it's very much of a muchness. The materials are different, but it's the same guidelines. So you need to submit by the 18th of June. Another thing that I was interested, if you want to stick it in the text chat, obviously the 18th of June sounds like quite a while, but because of all the extra processes that are in place after they've left you as head of science and, in terms of SLT and signing off, I was just interested to know what's the date that you're working to as heads of science in terms of your final date to then allow the other processes in schools. I just thought it'd be quite interesting to see how you compare across different schools. So you'll be able to see that in the text chat. Obviously, keep an eye on the websites. I've picked out something new just this week on Monday. The Offcourse Student Guide to Awarding for Summer 2021, specifically for students, has come out this week. There's no mandatory process, so just, if you hear that somebody's doing slightly different today, don't worry about it. You're allowed to do something slightly different as long as it's rigorous and as long as it's robust. So you can see in the text chat, we've got quite a variation actually in what you're working to in terms of the date for your deadlines. Next bit, grades awarded based on evidence from material covered. So two things there. You only need to assess them on the material that you've covered and not on the whole course, and you need evidence for the grades. You can't use trajectories or predicted grades. We've now got, only last week, the autumn series is now confirmed. So we've got AS levels and A levels will take place in October and November, December, either for students that couldn't get an assessment this time or that want to improve the grade. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, so just looking at your dates that are coming in, a lot of you are working to the 28th of May, 9th of June, yeah, most of you 18th of May. Okay, so we're nearly there, aren't we? Okay, support available. You've got JCQ and AO. That link, that second one, is just something from AQA. So it's Elise Rees, who's overseeing the curriculum lead now for science. She's just put together, it's a little talking heads video of things to consider when you're gathering your evidence. You're probably too far down the line now, but it might just reassure you, because I think you'll find in that a lot of that is what you're doing anyway. You've then got your grade descriptors and the commentaries that come with those. So we've got grade descriptors we have them anyway at the start of these new GCSEs for 8, 5 and 2 grades. They've added in a 6 and a 4. And added in, probably the most useful bit of that is they've added in some guidance around the characteristics that separated a grade 3 and a grade 4. So if you really have got those borderline students as a final kind of check or a bit of support, you could be looking at those grade boundaries, because obviously that decision around 3s and 4s is really difficult, isn't it? You don't want to get that one wrong. And commentaries that go with those specific to your exam board. So they've taken student answers from past papers where they believe that they sit right in the middle of that grade, so that you can do some sort of final check, or just if you need to do those borderline checks, or you've got somebody that you're just not sure of, you can refer to those grade descriptors for those. Additional assessments, some of you are using them, I think, and some of them aren't. You've probably noticed that they're all just past questions anyway, so you've probably seen a lot of those. So they include also the specimens that I know some of us didn't think that they looked much like the real thing once we got the new GCSE, but they include specimen questions as well. And just a note there to say, on Exam Pro and Exam Wizard, you'll notice as well that 2019 questions are in there, because they're also in the additional assessments. So we're in an unusual position. 2019 papers are still secure, still under padlock, but actually questions have been released in the additional assessments and through Exam Pro and Exam Wizard. So it's a bit unusual situation that they are secure, but actually out there, but not as a whole paper with a mark scheme. Next one, Joe. Okay, so this slide here really is just to generate any questions or generate any discussion. So thinking about where you get your evidence from. The exam boards keep saying you can use evidence from across the whole course if you want to. You're probably using more recent assessments. I know some subject leaders that I've spoken to have said, I just don't think it's fair to use assessments from last year when the students didn't know that that was going towards the GCSE. But they are saying you can use from across the course, even though you might want to weight assessments that you've done right now. We've said that second one about grades need to be evidence, not trajectories or predicted. How much evidence? I'm sure you've all been thinking about how much evidence. JCQ say 3 to 5 pieces of evidence. AQA have been really clear that they say 2 to 3 pieces of evidence would be enough if they're larger assessments. So you might want to do 2 or 3 larger assessments and then gap fill with just some part of the additional assessments. And that fits with that next bullet point. You've got common questions that are useful if you've got students around grades 4 and 5. That grade descriptors bit is just to make the point there that the exam boards are talking about using those grade descriptors as a fine tuning, not that you would implement those with everybody, but you might want to do a bit of fine tuning for ones that you can't quite make a decision on. Or I think what I would be doing is just saying, okay, we've made our decisions. I might just do some random sampling, look at the grade descriptors, see does that match with decisions that we've already made. So a random sampling rather than your whole cohort. Rank order. So it'd be interesting today to know how many of you are planning to use rank order. So I really feel for you in that in some ways you feel pulled in different directions in terms of everything's got to be based on evidence. It can't be a trajectory or a prediction. You've got to have the evidence there, but you've also got to do this sense check of previous outcomes. And I'm sure at some point rank order is going to come into that, whether it's just a final check at the end to see, are you in line with previous outcomes and how close do you need to be to that? Or I know some subject leaders are using rank order much earlier on in the process than that. Just to mention that the grades got to match the tier entry, but actually you can change the tier entry free of charge for both AQA and Edexcel. So it doesn't really matter if you're getting somebody that you can't match their tier entry, just change their tier that you're entering them for. It's free to do. Combined Science is still using the 17-point grading system. So if you find that a student sits right between the 6 and the 7, for Combined Science, you would give them the 7-6. And then the final point, moderation, what you're doing around that, really a lot of that is what this is about today, isn't it? How are you managing to do that in your own setting, with your own department? Are you managing to get to work with other subject leaders? And I think Joe and Dan, I think, are going to talk a little bit more around that as well. And then the final slide from me is just to flag a document in case it's useful and I can send it over. This just takes the grade descriptors for science, so the 8, 6, 5, 4 and 2. And Elise Rees from AQA has put this together just to show sort of a progression table, so it just makes it easier to do that comparison along the different strands of the grade descriptors if you want to use that as a check rather than in the list form that it was originally provided from JCQ. And that's me, Joe, over to you to lead your discussions.
Thank you, Tracy. That was really useful to have that oversight. So what we'll do from now is we'll obviously open up into more of a discussion. I came up with some points here on the screen as well, which we can obviously talk through. It was advertised that there'll be an optional discussion for post-16 or entry-level certificate following this. But I think it makes sense to do the GCSE as a whole, and if people want individual conversations then in smaller groups afterwards for post-16 A-levels or BTEC and ELC, that would be useful as a separate conversation. My thinking is that we'll talk through some of these points. Obviously, I've got them all on the screen there to make you squint and not be able to see them very well, but they're all on the screen there for us to talk through and to kind of see my thinking for where I am with this. I know I've spoken to 3 or 4 of you as well, and this is kind of the structure in which we kind of thought to go through. So if we take one of these at a time, obviously it'd be useful if people are willing to talk about what they've done, what they're doing for that reassurance for each other. And obviously, if we talk about what we're doing and what we're planning to do, we can obviously get ideas from each other as well, and reassure ourselves. So what I've got on there is the first one: what evidence are you using? What evidence did you have? And what evidence are you collecting now? And I've also put in there, actually, how have you determined that high, medium and low level of control? Because on the JCQ document, it says that it should be high, medium and low, but there's not really an indication as to what high, medium and low is. And obviously each school could be doing that differently. And my understanding is, although I'm sure Tracy will interject if it's not true, that actually as long as you stick to what your policy is, that's going to be okay when it is, or if it is, looked at in detail. Does anybody want to share anything in which they've got on those on that first one? What evidence are you going to use? Is it past papers or along those lines? Either in the chat, I'm more than happy to say comments, or if you want to put a hand up or unmute, then fantastic, please do. It's an open network conversation. Dan, I can see your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, does this work? It's new. Yep,
yes.
Great. Happy to just talk through what we're doing. So we have two big sets of mocks, which we did in December and March, which we're using for our main basis for evidence. And the last 6 weeks, we've run what we've called a mini assessment plan, where we've looked at our curriculum coverage and compared it against what topics were and were not assessed in the papers, picked out some topics that we have taught that haven't been assessed, and then used the questions from the exam board and sort of split them up by looking at the AOs that were given from AQA, giving the sort of easier level questions, AO1s and some AO2s for the lowest grades in the sort of range that we want to rank the students, and then the harder questions from those tiers for the students we want to discriminate between at the higher level as well. So we sort of go into that level of assessment with an idea where the student's grade will be, and we're using these two further assessments to sort them into the correct order, so we've got them right within those grade ranges.
Brilliant, thanks Dan. I can see in the chat from John, 2 past papers, and I assume that's in addition to that a PPE in September and November. I'm not sure if that's 2 past papers in September and November or additional papers, but I think that, go on John, are you able to speak? Sorry, go for it. John, we can't hear you properly, you're all broken up.
Is that better?
Not really.
I wrote it down, that's fine.
Yeah, if you could write it down, I think. Yeah, sorry John. So we've got that. What I can see is that Bex with your hand up.
It is. Hopefully you can
it.
hear me.
Yeah, can hear you.
Brilliant. Okay. So in terms of the evidence at Torbridge, we've got some past papers, which we're going to use as one source of evidence. We've also got end of unit tests. Again, another source of evidence. We've got a May assessment window over a fortnight, which has started this week. So that will also form part of our evidence. That will be quite a high level control, so done in as close as exam conditions as we possibly can. In addition to that, we're also looking and taking into consideration classwork, obviously the written element, but also verbal feedback as well that you sort of pick up through obviously your lessons. But obviously that's classed as we've classed that as a low level control. And so in terms of evidence, essentially we're using these sort of 4 main areas to hopefully come up with some reasonable grades.
Can I just aspects at the back of that, you mentioned about verbal answers. I think this comes down to one further down perhaps, but how are you evidencing those verbal answers if you are?
It's not physical evidence as such. It's all sort of links in with the classwork. So in terms of physical evidence in classwork, obviously we've got we still do have some of their exercise books which we can use, but also we've been asked to comment on every single student as to how we're pulling together this information. So even though, I've got students in my class, they might not do so well written, but certainly verbally they're extremely extremely switched on in terms of the answers that they're given.
Thank you. I'll be interested off a point that you said there, actually, to know if anyone else has to write down an individual statement, you said, per student, because what we're doing is we're very much, we kind of got the whole cohort, we're using these papers from these dates, whereas you've also taken a different approach on that one. I don't know if people want to put in the chat if they are having to do like a statement for each student, if you like, for where the evidence is coming from, or whether you've got a department, this is where the evidence is coming from for everything. I can see some comments coming into the chat. So we've got from Tracy, the challenge with classwork and verbal is the consistency that's needed across the cohorts as far as possible. Completely agree, and I think that falls back to what you were saying, Bex, about how actually that must fall then into that low control piece of evidence there, as opposed to being anything more than that. The Dan's put, there's no statement made as such for each student, but the grade decisions are made in a meeting with the head of department, so each discussed, and there's 2 points of decision marking. So is each piece of work, Dan, that you've got being marked by 2 people? Is that what you're saying there?
And it was so obviously some of them have with the moderation process. What I mean is when we've got our mark book that has all of the sort of headlines from the evidence that we've collected, I'll be sitting down with each of the teachers and making the decision on the grade with them, just to make sure that we keep it objective and biased, because while, you know, the marking has all been candidate number only, when they see the name of the student who's worked really hard, then they might be inclined to give them a higher grade. So I'm there as part of the process to say, well, actually the evidence says this, so what's your justification for saying this is the grade? And make sure that it is based on the evidence and not on anything else. Yeah.
So if that teacher was to then come back to you and say, actually, Dan, from data you've awarded this student a 4, I think they're working at a 5, are you then going to have to go back to that teacher and say, actually, where's the evidence? Or
yeah, so the
judgment, actually, that professional conversation, you're going to record that professional conversation, and is that the evidence?
So the evidence, each student has a file for their evidence. So if the teacher sort of is suggesting something outside the evidence, then we will take a look at the evidence folder, look at the grade descriptors, and then we can use that to make sure that the decision that they're suggesting should be made is accurate. Obviously, there may well be situations where you've got students who have done really well at answering all of the most complicated questions in a paper, but have left out the single marks, which would give them a lower score, but they've demonstrated understanding. So it could happen, but I would say more often than not, we're basing it on the evidence that we have, which is the graded papers that they have set.
Yeah, I like that idea actually, because I'm assuming from the graded papers you're applying that to a mark scheme and grade boundaries, but then you're saying you can fall back on those grade descriptors if it's not adding up. For example, like you said, they've missed out the tick 2 boxes questions.
Yeah.
There. Thank you. There's some more comments coming into the chat from, I'll go back up, from John. So as well as those mocks in which you're doing, you've got mini assessments developed in-house from the AQA exam structure with AO1, AO2, AO3 percentages there. All assessment internally marked or verified by science leads, 20% randoms of students, justification and rationale of the document. Year 11 teachers have completed the AQA mark science scheme guidance. Yeah, I think that's a really important document, actually, that consistency document in which AQA provided, didn't they, online. We've got from Emma in the chat, I can see some hands up as well. Emma in the chat said, no statement individually, but have to write those send statements. I assume, Emma, what you're referring to there is what's in the JCQ template in which it's been given. And Claire has said from ACE, the very individual nature of the students here, every student will have a statement. And I think that falls back to the nature of your school, Claire, doesn't it, in a lot of ways. Thank you. Tracy, I can see your hands up. I think that we'll then move on to the next points there.
Yeah, I just wanted to back up really what Dan had said about what he's described there is exactly, you know, one of the ways that the grade descriptors could be used. So I would say, if you haven't used the grade descriptors yet, you could possibly find some use for them later on. And I think I would just be finding some use for them, like I said, in just sampling a few papers and checking against the grade descriptors. But then what Dan described about, you've got a little bit of discrepancy in terms of how people are judging it. That's where those grade descriptors will really come in. And I do really feel where they've tried to do a difference in the characteristics of the 3 and the 4, that could be really useful, because to make that 3 choice is really hard, isn't it, versus that 4. So that's a really good use of them. And the additional assessment material, which I know are just past papers, but you know, the exam boards are talking about, if you've done these long assessments, but you still feel that there's a bit of evidence missing on AO1 or AO3, you know, you've got the mapping documents from those assessments as well. You could just take part of those assessments and pick out, you know, some extended open response or some AO2, for example, if you wanted to do that. The one challenge you've got with that is they still want to see consistency in what students are being offered as an assessment. So, you know, you can't just pick out individual assessments for individual students unless you've got a good reason to do that.
Lovely, thank you, Tracy. Dan, has your hand gone up?
Yeah, I just based on what Tracy just said, I just found that the materials they have released, although they are just sort of repeats of the questions, what's been really useful is that the mark schemes all show which marks are awarded for AO1, 2 and 3. And actually some of the marks surprised me. You know, what I would attribute to a 3 was actually a 2 or even in some cases a 1, just based off of the way the question is worded. So it's actually been really educational. I think it's going to be beneficial for the future.
Yeah, brilliant. We're actually thinking a future point of taking some of those for our end of topic tests in the future going forward, those papers in which AQA have produced, because they are modular. And yes, we can make our own from Exam Pro, but actually they're written with those weightings of AO1, AO2, AO3, probably better than we could realistically. If we take a look at that main second point there, so how will you determine the grade? I think we've got a common consensus that we're doing largely past papers and or mixed in with mini assessments. It's probably those high control levels or pieces of evidence. But let's say you've got a student with 4, 4, 6, 6 on their pieces of evidence. How are we then going to award those students a grade? And if you've got a 4, 4, 6, 6, how's that different to a 4, 5, 6, 7 in terms of final grade? You just lost your numbers there. But how are you then going to apply that to a single grade for a student? Does it come back to percentage on papers? Where does that come from? And obviously, I think Tracy mentioned at the start for the combined science, which I think most of us will have entries for. Personally, I find it very easy to say that paper is a grade 7. So is consistently just hitting 7 good enough to get a 8-7? Or do students need to be actually consistently hitting the top end of level 7 to get an 8-7? So does anyone have any comments to put in or raise hands and mention regarding anything in that second point there? I can see there's several people talking in the chat. Anyone wants to put their hand up or unmute, then feel free. For what are you doing? How are you determining that?
I mean, I'm not shy if nobody else wants to talk.
Go on, Dan.
So sort of just to link back what I said earlier, I would describe our assessment plan really as like a funnel. So every time we've looked at the assessments, we've been trying to sort of fine tune. So in December, we used that as a space to make tiering decisions. So students that needed to change tiers, we based those on the assessment from December. And then in the March assessments, we've used that to sort of narrowly pick where we think they are in terms of like a 3-grade boundary. The first mini assessment we've done, we'll rank those students, and what we are doing is mixing the level of questions between the first assessment and the second, so I can have some crossover to try and work out the difference between those students who got the top of the grade 3 paper that we have set versus those at the bottom of the grade 4-5 paper we set, and use those multiple points to just sort of try and hone in until we arrive at a grade. So we're not in a position where we're looking at lots of different grades and saying, well, is it an average of all of them? It's more like a narrative of us sort of honing in on the right grade, because we provided them with a much narrower set of questions that are all more similar in skill level, rather than a whole paper which has got, you know, a wide range.
Thank you, Dan. That's really useful. I've got from Tracy in the chat, a 7 is counted as the middle of a grade if they're getting a high 7 in self-assessments, probably an 8-7. Again, grade descriptors would be useful there. Thank you, Tracy. And Emma's just put in, we're using an average percentage across all the assessments, across each science paper, referring to the 2019 boundaries and 2020 boundaries. The 2020 boundaries are not that realistic, so perhaps some warning around those 2020 boundaries. I don't know if other people feel that those 2020 boundaries aren't realistic. Personally, what we're looking at the moment is we have done some 2020 papers here and we've taken those boundaries, but is the feeling that actually those boundaries aren't realistic because of that much smaller cohort which sat those papers? And comments in the chat might be useful for that. If you've got any comments on those 2020 boundaries, that's something I'd be interested in personally. So Tracy's just put in another comment there. Thank you. Even the 2019 boundaries, are they going to be particularly useful for this cohort? Because those students that sat that paper in 2019 will have sat the full course, whereas in now those students have only done certain modules, so perhaps they haven't been tested across that whole paper. What's your view, Tracy, that if you've taught all of, let's say, biology paper 1, and the students sit a biology paper 1 now with us, and they've been taught all of that content, would you think those boundaries are realistic, or only not realistic if they've not done certain modules from that paper, or if they've been taught some modules online, maybe?
I think it's really difficult to go with the grade boundaries from 2019 because the way the grade boundaries are generated. The grade boundaries are only generated when the whole cohort's performed, and it obviously depends how the whole national cohort performs of where those grade boundaries sit. So this is where I think if you really do want to generate some grade boundaries, you'd have to introduce some kind of rank order and then work out how to shift your grade boundaries down. So you'd be looking at, just like with GCSEs every year, apart from last year, it's comparative outcomes. So every year we get a similar proportion of 7s and a similar proportion of 5s across the whole cohort, because they'll mark all the papers and then set the grade boundaries so that that curve looks the same as it did last year. So that's what you would need to be doing, really, if you're going to look at grade boundaries. You're going to have to compare to previous performance, aren't you, of your cohort? You'd have to get them to sit the exam or your assessment, so get your average mark, or your average percentage. Then you'd have to rank order them, and then you'd have to look at, okay, realistically, what proportion are we expecting to get of grade 5s, grade 7s, grade 9s, and you'd have to generate your grade boundaries like that. And I've spoken to AQA about this, and that is what they're saying as well. That's how they perceive that you could possibly come up with grade boundaries. But it'd be difficult for your students it'd just be so difficult to judge because of, as you said, Joe, they haven't had the whole course, they haven't had, but you're also not testing them on everything. There's just too many things have changed to assume that the grade boundaries would be, the same as they were in 2019. Yeah.
Thank you, Tracy. We've got some more comments from Emma here. Thank you. To 2020 students would have been taught the whole course also. Yes, I don't know if you've got more to add there, Tracy, and we are comparing to previous years from 2017 onwards and looking at our projection. So obviously, absolutely, and I completely agree with that. If your school has improved over the last 3 or 4 years, and I think heads of school or heads of exams in school have already submitted a JCQ document outlining those trends in roughly where the school is going to end up at the end. I think that's a really important point. And actually what Tracy's saying as well, that if we need to adapt those grade boundaries, then we've got that flexibility to do it. And it's nice to hear from Tracy as well that actually AQA and EdXL are supporting that, and they're not going to come and say you've changed your grade boundaries. I don't trust that as a judgment. So thank you. I can see some more people are typing in the chat. I'll wait for a few more comments to come through there, and we'll move on to the next point. Just conscious that time is ticking, and we could talk about these for weeks, I'm sure. So thank you, Tracy. The projection is important. It's not the same every year, and if you have improved, fight your corner. So I think that's really important there. Thank you. I can see Dan is just typing. So Dan's not using grade boundaries at all. So what Dan's doing is going back to that percentage ranking and then comparing that back to previous years. So not even applying a grade boundary, but just a ranking and then fitting that to the data for where they're expecting to be. And that's two ways in which we can look at this, really. Fantastic. If we take a look at the third point there, so how are you moderating the work in marking? And have you actually got consistency in your team if you've got to that point? If you've got a large department, possibly NQTs, possibly very experienced teachers, are you having to moderate across specialisms? So have you got a biology teacher doing some moderation on, so biology teacher moderating some physics, for example? Are you doing that internally? Are you doing that externally? Are you doing both of those? Are you picking these students carefully, or are you just going for a random sample of students? Are you getting one person to mark one of the paper? Are you doing one paper that the whole department's marking? How are people approaching this one? Again, if you want to raise a hand for what you want to say, I'm sure Dan will be putting his hand up if no one else does. Or again, type into the chat and obviously I can verbalise what you're saying there. I know that we've had a conversation, Dan, about this, and Bex and other Dan as well, about what we're doing. It'd be interesting to know what other people are doing on that one as well. Claire as well, obviously much smaller cohort. Be interesting to hear what you're doing there.
Right. OK, so there are 3 science teachers at ACE, and sort of one's biology, one's chemistry and one's physics, which sort of helps a little bit. But most of our teachers that deliver science, because out of the 9 bases, don't have science as a specialism. So we actually are going to be, we're doing a lot of marking ourselves, or if somebody feels up to doing the marking, then we're actually double marking anything that they're actually doing. We have done some past papers, but because of the vocational nature of a lot of our students, not all of them will do past papers. So we are relying on mini papers we've made, and we're using grade boundaries, the grade descriptors, to actually moderate most of those, so we get an idea what they are instead of looking at the marks. So we're going to be moderate after we've marked. We're going to then moderate each other to a certain degree, and then we're going to do a slice through, some tops, some bottoms, and then random generate some numbers, and hopefully then we'll have covered everything and there won't be any big mistakes. That is what we're planning at the moment, but we're still gathering evidence at the moment. So
yeah, really interesting. Thank you, Colette. We are as well. We're still gathering evidence as we speak. I can see John's just put a long comment in there. Let me just read it out. So if students are being assessed on shorter topics rather than sitting a whole paper, the cognitive load and time required for them to retain the information before the assessment is less. This in turn is giving us higher than normal mean percentages rather than using grade boundaries. And what we are investigating is that the foundation and higher tier means that using them to help generate the tag in terms of verification are science leads and markers, and verifying a 20% random sample to feed back to individuals and the team. Thank you, John. So you got a thumbs up there, and Dan on the one about grade boundaries. Sorry, not using grade boundaries above. Really useful as well to hear that. Thank you. I know that myself, Dan and Bex are looking at doing some externally moderated. So we're looking at sending some samples of work off to other schools. I don't know if other people are planning on doing this, or whether we might want to set something up now between some other schools. So we're sending across 3 pieces of or 3 evidence folders from here to those schools. We're obviously removing names, and we're just getting them to have a look over. Do you think this is roughly a level 7 for when it's awarded based on what you can see here? And obviously we've got that check then across several departments, which is going to confirm for me that our grading isn't unrealistic compared to A, previous years, B, other schools. So for me, that's going to be really, really powerful. I know that I mentioned to Dan and Bex that what we're also doing, and my department don't know this, is we're picking students in which we intentionally know that parents or the students themselves might either be borderline or the parents might be difficult or make an appeal. So we've got that extra level for those students. Obviously, we can't do every student, and it's not only limited to those students. But that's obviously something in which we're doing, is that second check there. So what do people think about that? If people aren't involved in that, do people want to now set up a group that they can send those across to other schools and have that student A's work marked or just confirmed that that's a level 5 by somebody else? I don't know if people want to, I can see people are typing in the chat. If people want to comment about what they're doing as well, and that'd be great.
Joe, just while you wait for those to come in, I'd like to thank you for last time we spoke, you mentioning that list of vulnerable students that parents are likely to complain, because I passed it on to the leadership team here and they were thrilled that they had that as an idea. Yeah,
thanks, Dan. It's just one of those things that we spoke about, but actually that's a really easy thing which we can do. And OK, we're not going to hit all of those parents or students, but we will hit some of them, and to have that check. Thank you. See, Tracy's put that in there. Thank you, Tracy, into the chat. And I've got on the end here, how are you removing conscious or unconscious bias? So I know that somebody earlier mentioned that what they're doing is they're marking all the papers without names on the front. I've spoken to other departments as well, and what they're doing is they're not marking their own class set of papers. I'm sure there's a whole range of things which people are doing. I don't know if people want, again, to pop in the chat what they're doing to remove both conscious and unconscious bias. I know both come up if you read the documents, as to how you're approaching those points there, other than, and I think we kind of said it, we're just marking blind papers or somebody else's papers. Is there anything else that I haven't thought about or that people are doing that they think is good practice there?
I think with the whole bias issue, where you haven't got very much evidence, it's really important to be careful about the decisions that you're making. I think it'd be very easy to assume that students who have poor attendance would not necessarily score well, but that's not always the case. So we've been really careful with those students that we have limited evidence to make sure that we, first of all, have enough to make an award, and we're not just making an estimate based on what we think is a trajectory for them, but secondly that we're making a fair judgment as well, not just that they're not here, so they're only going to get a 3 or they're only going to get 2.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Claire, I can see your hands come up, which I assume this comment is particularly pertinent to you.
Well, it's just something I just wanted to say, is that the mental health that's been affected with the kids. Now, I kind of probably see that more as an extreme, but I'm sure some of your students, that's going to be something that you might need to take into consideration. Now, I've got one student since the third lockdown who is really, really good at science that I haven't seen because she's just got to the stage she can't get out of the house. And so we're putting all sorts of things in to be able to get some assessment papers. She will do the work for us, but she just can't get out of the door now. So I just was wondering if anyone else has got any ideas about how they're kind of making sure the assessment is fair for these students that are suffering with their mental health at the moment, really. It's interesting.
It is interesting, Claire, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because we're in the same situation here. Even though we've got 150 students, we've got some students who have since COVID not attended, and I second that it's very, very difficult to get that evidence. And how do you then, because if you send a paper home, you're instantly putting that in our grading down to low control assessment, so that's nowhere near going to have that same weighting in terms of the grade in which you can award as a student that's done it here under exam conditions. And I haven't got an answer to that. I don't know if anyone's got any ideas in which they're using to work around that.
Well, I can tell you what our outreach team are doing with some of our students. It's still not high demand, but what they're doing is that with some of the different papers, mini papers, they're going out sealed, and parents have written a declaration to say that that they're kind of do this in sort of exam conditions. And the paper is actually opened whilst they're on Teams, and the child actually then does the paper in front of the outreach team whilst they're on Teams, and then it's sealed up in front of them again, and it then comes back in and somebody picks it up from the doorstep. Now, I'm not going to say it's the most effective way, and it's not something you can do with a large number of students, but that's what we're trying with a small, very, very small number of students who are very anxious that they feel that they need to be part of the assessment process. But as you say, ideas on a postcard.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are really tricky students to get that, and how to make sure that is fair and you haven't got that bias from lack of evidence or anything that is sitting with that. I can see some comments coming into the chat. John saying is using candidate numbers and staff and not marking their own classes, so you're not seeing the name of that student at all as part of that process. Tracy's put, you could add in a final check on a few students that you know might be prone to bias, for example, bright but naughty students or lovely but not so bright. So I think that almost comes back to that, not that difficult parent list, but that's another list in which you could have there. I like that idea. So hearing some sad stories about pupils that will be missed because of this, especially in larger schools or without capacity for individual support. Absolutely. No answers, but obviously I think you've just put in there, Trace, that they have got that autumn series in which they can sit.
Although a lot of these pupils are probably the ones that aren't likely to take on an autumn series either, are they? So I feel a bit helpless about that, and I don't think there's I haven't come across an answer. I've spoken to AQA recently saying, you know, I've come work with schools that have got students like you've just described that just haven't been able to get back into school, and the answer just seems to be, well, there isn't any evidence. It just yeah, it's sad, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Just looking at the time, let's move on to the last point there. Thank you for the discussion on that one. So how are you recording this evidence ready for sampling? The deadlines for the sampling are obviously very short, and you've got to get that evidence off within 48 hours to the exam board to look at. So really what I'm reading for that is it needs to be there for every student. I can go to a filing cabinet, grab student Y's work and send it off. There's no messing around trying to get anything together. It's there, ready to go. I know we've mentioned about them being in folders. I think Dan mentioned that earlier. I assume that people are doing the JCQ documents on top of that, in which we've probably all seen for which assessments are being, or which topics throughout are being assessed over. Is anyone doing anything additionally to that or differently to that that we might not have thought about, or you think is working really well?
I know that we are storing all of our work, not in departments, but in the exams office, so that whenever anything is called, even if it is after results and appeals, that the exams team have access to that, and we don't have to, look for it around the school, because the deadline's really tight when they request it. So having the exams team know where it is already, I think, is really important. Yeah,
thank you. That's something that I'll take back here actually to our leadership team, that might be something really worthwhile doing, because we've each got it in our department at the moment, but even if once we've submitted the grade it's then moved down to a central location, that could be really useful, especially if there's an appeal in the summer or at some point. That would be really useful. So it's all that. I can see Claire, Bex and one other are typing into the chat. If it's easier for anyone typing, if you want to unmute and speak, if that's easier. Bex said that's what they're doing as well. I see some more people typing in the chat. So in an enclosed area that the exam officer can access. That's useful, Claire. I assume, Claire, by that of Teams, you mean for the online work in which they're submitting?
Hi, no, we've got a closed area for exams on Teams, which only heads of department and the exam officer and the person in SLT who relates to. And so if we have evidence for a child, it goes into a folder within that. So it's all scanned in. So it's just ready with the stuff that we're going to want to send off. Yeah, that's just because a lot of it's coming in scanned anyway, because we can't go down to Camborne or to St Austell or up to Exeter or Tiverton. So it's the easiest way for us to kind of get things in at the moment. So it's just a transfer job.
Yeah, I like that idea that it's on there electronically so anyone can access it. I assume even if you're at home over the summer holidays, dare I say we ever do any work in the summer holidays, but if you're at home over the summer holidays, you've got access to it without needing to come in. See, Dan is there as well, saying that there's going to be a lot of space needed to put all this evidence somewhere. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for that conversation. I've personally found that really useful. I hope you have too, either being reassured or picking up little bits in which we've said. We said at the start we'd take this and have a little look at, is there anything that we want to take from these exams really forward into good practice for the current year 10 or even 9s, 8s and so on? And is there anything that actually we've taken out of this that we can take into Key Stage 3, moderation or cross-department working? Is, for example, my teacher marking here, has this highlighted to me that teacher marking isn't consistent across the department, or anything along those lines? I think this is something which we might want to go forwards and think about. And what are our plans for year 11 once the grades are submitted? Are students staying with us to pick up on more content in which they haven't been taught? Are year 11 actually starting A levels early? When are year 11 going? So open conversation really about any of those comments on there that we can take forward after this process is over. I can see more, or Tracy's typing into the chat there. I mentioned earlier for us that we're looking at those end of topic tests, or those shorter tests in which AQA have produced online that we'll probably take forward and use as end of topic tests, because realistically I think they're probably better than what we made 2 or 3 years ago and which we used. So that'll be updated for us.
Joe, I'm sure everybody is absolutely sick of hearing what I have to say, but I've got something to add again. So the big thing for me that I've learned with this is to do with how I'm going to mark large mock series moving forwards and moderate, because whereas normally we would, even if we swap classes, teachers would be marking the biology paper, the chemistry paper, the physics paper, and then for moderation that just adds so much more variation and so much such a bigger sample is required. So this time what we did is we split them into teams. So I had a team marking biology, so there's only a few people marking those biology papers, which means that we could invest the time first of all in standardizing, and then moderating we didn't need to moderate as many people. And I noticed that first off we could reduce the variance that was there, but equally it was easier to spot problems, and we knew who to go to correct things. It meant that people were more secure with their knowledge of the mark schemes, because they weren't having to learn the 3 mark schemes to do the papers, and it was faster for us and for the markers as well. I think I'm going to do that from now on, because it just worked so much more smoothly.
That's interesting. Thank you, Dan. I see Tracy's put into the chat that both AQA and Edexcel have both transition booklets from GCSE onto A level, which I know we've used in the past, but actually what we've done here in the past, we've kind of rushed over them quite quickly. We haven't had overly long to do them. If you've got year 11 staying with you, maybe that's something in which you could do. And thank you, Dan, like I said, for that comment about actually having teams marking a specific paper, but marking more of that same paper as you move through. We'll open up in a moment if people want to stay and talk about A level or BTEC or ELC, but before that, and I'm sure some people don't offer that and aren't interested in that, is there anything in which we think collectively would be a good topic of conversation for another one of these network meetings? What are you focusing on in your department? What do you think actually I could do with a second opinion on that from other people that are working around those same constraints? Or anything in which you want to progress in your department that you might want to have thoughts about from other people? Again, feel free to unmute. Dan's going to make some comments. We can obviously come up with an agenda for a following session based on that, or drop it into the chat. So latest Ofsted research from Tracy as a possible future comment.
Yeah, I was going to suggest looking at what people are doing with regards to practical work, you know, with the going back to normal. And I know that features in there, so I've been looking at that. Thankfully, it is in line with everything that I'd already been reading elsewhere, so it's not been a direction change, but it's quite interesting. I think we have a really important opportunity that we're not going to get again. We've got like a natural break. Students are not used to doing practical work in the same way they ever have done before because of the restrictions, at least at our school. And I'm using that as a chance to completely restart how we use practical work, making sure it's not just an activity to fill time. It needs to be related to learning. It needs to be sequenced appropriately, and it needs to be safe. Which I think, you know, in the past it's not always been at the forefront of people's minds to make sure that they've got a safely planned, risk assessed practical to deliver when they just maybe this wasn't everybody, but I'm sure I've seen it somewhere before, showing up to the lesson with a practical trolley and thought, oh well, that's my hour sorted, off you go.
Yeah, really interesting. Would it be fair to tie in with that, or maybe this is too much to put together, about the working scientific statements and how those are mapped across what you're actually doing and how all of that fits together, possibly I'm just adding to the list now, but the mathematical skills that fit in with that as well. Tracy, I can see your hands up.
Just to say really that the Ofsted research thing, I think, is definitely worth a look at. The section on practical work is quite a chunky section of that, and I think you'll find the same as Dan. You go, okay, it's nothing I didn't know, but there might be stuff in there that you haven't really focused on. It definitely fits with the working scientifically. It talks about the research around working scientifically skills and making sure that they're in a context and they're not these standalone skills. So really trying to make sure that if you're relaunching your practical work, making that effective, that would definitely work around you working scientifically as well. So they would link together.
Fantastic.
I really want to link it in with the research on cognitive load theory as well, and working memory, because I think we've been really guilty in the past of doing these things because we think they're good for learning, and students, oh, they're going to find out, but actually they're children. They're not scientists. They're not doing a research paper. They're not going to find out the relationship you want them to. We need to teach them that first. They can see it and it can help them to remember it, but I don't think, you know, they should be teaching themselves with chemicals.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. I'd love to have a half-hour conversation on that right now, but I think other people probably wouldn't. Thank you to all those that don't want to stay, and thank you for Tracy and Heidi as well for your inputs. That's really invaluable. What we'll do, we'll go away and we'll have a think about an agenda based on those points, the Ofsted criteria, practical work, working scientifically, and how we do that and how we make sure it's effective and useful, and come up with an agenda for another network meeting. Out of interest, perhaps hands up if people do want to stay for the optional GCE, ELC, BTEC discussion. Other than that, thank you so much. I'm saying hands up and thank you so much at the same time. If people want to stay, I suggest people just stay in the chat and cool. People want to drop out, I will by no means be offended at this point. You might not offer A levels or anything like that, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your input. Hopefully it's been useful. And what we'll obviously do, we'll send out minutes. I'll send out these PowerPoint slides. I think Heidi's got the link in which she wants to put it out there as well. So we'll send all of that out within the next couple of days, and hopefully we'll see you all again for the discussion we can have about the Ofsted research, practical work, working scientifically. Tracy, your hand is up.
It was only to say that you will be getting an evaluation form. If people are dropping out now, you'll get an evaluation form dropping into your email. So please do fill that in. It'll be really useful. It's useful for STEM learning. It'd be useful for us, Joe, won't it? Just to look at what people want. You've got a chance on there as well to put on what would be useful next. So if you have other ideas for these sessions, stick them on there and we'll make sure they're all fed back to Joe.
Fantastic, thank you. And by all means, you've got my email address in the invite. Please do drop me an email. I'm more than happy to have another Teams call with you individually or share what we're doing here if you are interested in that. If you drop out, thank you so much. If people want to stay, we can repeat the conversation really for the post-16 comments on there.
Thanks very much. I've got to go to pick up the parents' evening, so
Enjoy parents' evening, Dan.
bye.
Bye. Thank you, Joe.
Bye, Bex. Thank you for your input.
No worries. Take care. Bye.
Yeah, see you later.
Bye.
Let's see, is left. We've got Andy left in the chat. Ben is from here. Steve's from here about post-16 and A-level and BTEC, in which I don't know much about, but he knows a lot about. So, Dan, are you staying 4 minutes, or did you want a further conversation about any of these points?
Yeah, no, I can stay in and join in as well. I'll
Okay.
keep minutes in.
Emma, are you there for comments, or have you just not signed out? Just so I know who we're talking to. Can't hear from Emma. So it looks like it's just, let me get this right, Steve and Dan probably stood in the chat. Ben is from Egg Buckland, and I know he won't be overly interested in it because he talks to Steve anyway. He's just down in the other room. Dan, did you have any questions or comments that you wanted to talk through that with? Because really, Steve Matic-Booth, who's in the chat, is the best person to talk that through with.
No, I'm just sticking around to see what was said. That's all.
Okay.
All my post-16 stuff's been done by. Well, today was the last day for us, so I was just going to see if we're all along the same lines. But it sounds like I am with everything else, so I imagine it'll be fine.
Wonderful. In which case, I don't think there's any need to have this optional discussion, unless Emma is staying in for this. But I'm not